They thought the storm had swallowed her whole. No tracks, no trace, just a backpacker who seemed to vanish into the mountains as if she'd never been there at all. But 4 years later, on a quiet summer morning, two kayakers gliding beneath a forgotten bridge would make a discovery that didn't just solve a mystery. It created a nightmare that still haunts investigators today. It was October 15, 2009, when 27-year-old Leah Morgan shouldered her emerald green backpack for what should have been a routine 5-day trek through the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. This wasn't some spontaneous adventure. Leah had been planning this specific route for months, meticulously researching every trail junction, every water source, every potential campsite along the way. Leah wasn't some weekend warrior playing dress-up in expensive gear. She was methodical, obsessive even. Her apartment walls were covered with topographic maps marked in different colored pens. Red for completed trails, blue for planned routes, green for emergency exit points. Every piece of equipment had its designated place in her pack, weighed to the gram. Every route was researched, mapped, and filed with the Park Service 3 weeks in advance. She'd been hiking these mountains since she was 12, and in 15 years of wilderness adventures, she'd never missed a scheduled check-in, never been late, never deviated from her filed itinerary. Her friends often joked that Leah treated hiking like a military operation, but that obsessive preparation had kept her alive through countless solo adventures in some of the most challenging terrain on the East Coast. She'd summit Mount Washington in winter whiteout conditions. She'd navigated the technical scrambles of North Carolina's most remote peaks. She knew these mountains better than most park rangers. That October morning, she planned to tackle a challenging but familiar loop near Mount Mitchell, the tallest peak east of the Mississippi at 6,684 feet. The route would take her through some of the most spectacular terrain in the Appalachians. Ancient spruce fir forests that felt more like Canada than the American South, exposed ridgelines with panoramic views stretching to the horizon, and hidden valleys where mountain laurel bloomed in impossible profusion. The weather forecast called for light rain Tuesday and Wednesday, clearing by Thursday. Nothing a seasoned hiker like Leah couldn't handle in her sleep. She'd hiked this exact route in worse conditions. But as any experienced outdoors person knows, mountain weather has its own rules. And sometimes those rules can be deadly. By 2 p.m. on October 16th, what meteorologists later called a 1,000-year storm began forming over the Appalachian Ridge. A massive nor'easter, loaded with moisture from Hurricane Ida's remnants in the Atlantic, collided head-on with a warm, humid air mass streaming up from the Gulf of Mexico. The result was a weather bomb that would rewrite the record books. In 6 hours, the storm dumped 14 inches of rain across the Black Mountain Range. Creeks became torrents. Trails became waterfalls. Entire mountainsides, destabilized by the sudden deluge, began sliding downhill in massive sheets of mud and rock. The National Weather Service issued flash flood warnings, but by then, it was too late for anyone caught in the high country. Leah's last known location, according to her meticulously planned itinerary, was mile marker 47 on the Black Mountain Trail, a narrow ridge path that, in good weather, offered some of the most stunning views in North Carolina. The trail here runs along an exposed knife edge of rock, with 1,000-foot drops on both sides. In perfect conditions, it's challenging but manageable for experienced hikers. In a storm like this, it became a death trap with no escape route. Park rangers later estimated that some sections of the trail were under 6 feet of rushing water during the storm's peak. Ancient trees, some over 200 years old, were uprooted and swept away like matchsticks. When the storm finally passed 2 days later, the landscape had been transformed beyond recognition. Familiar landmarks had vanished. New creeks had carved themselves into existence overnight. The mountains themselves looked different. When Leah failed to check in at the ranger station on October 20th, 3 days past her scheduled return. Her emergency contact, her sister Sarah, knew immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. Leah had never, in 15 years of serious hiking, missed a check-in by more than a few hours. Within 6 hours of Sarah's frantic phone call, Yancey County Search and Rescue launched the largest missing person operation in the county's history. What they found over the next 2 weeks painted a picture of absolute chaos that defied belief. Leah's campsite, which according to her itinerary should have been located near Craggy Pinnacle, a relatively sheltered spot she'd used several times before, looked like it had been hit by a freight train and then struck by lightning for good measure. Her tent, a high-end, four-season mountaineering model designed to withstand hurricane-force winds, hung in shredded tatters from an oak tree 30 feet above the ground. Pieces of her sleeping bag were found wrapped around boulders nearly a mile away. A single hiking boot, size 8 women's, was discovered half-buried in a mudslide 2 miles downstream from her planned campsite. Her camp stove, a compact titanium model that weighed less than 3 ounces, was wedged so deeply in the rocky creek bed that it took 3 men with crowbars 15 minutes to extract it. They found her camp chair folded neatly and somehow wedged between 2 rocks 400 feet up a cliff face that would have been impossible for floodwater to reach. Her water bottles were scattered across a debris field that stretched for over 5 miles. Even her emergency whistle was recovered, bent nearly in half and tangled in the branches of a tree that had been completely stripped of bark by the rushing water. But here's what chilled the search teams to the bone. They found evidence of her camp, her gear scattered across miles of wilderness in a pattern that suggested unimaginable violence from the storm, but absolutely no trace of Leah herself. Not a piece of clothing that wasn't part of her camping gear. Not a bone fragment. Not even a strand of hair caught on a branch. It was as if she had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the material possessions that had shared her final night in the mountains. The search expanded to include swift water rescue teams, helicopters equipped with thermal imaging, and even specially trained cadaver dogs flown in from Virginia. They combed every creek bed, every cave, every crevice within a 20-mile radius of her last known position. Divers searched the deep pools where floodwater might have carried a body. Rock climbers rappelled into gorges too dangerous for ground teams to access. The official report, filed 6 months later after the search was reluctantly called off, concluded that Leah Morgan had been swept away by floodwaters and her remains carried into one of the countless deep pools, underground cave systems, or remote gorges that honeycomb the region. The mountains, the report noted with bureaucratic understatement, do not always give up their secrets. Case closed. File stamped. Another wilderness disappearance added to the growing list of people who had simply vanished into America's wild places. Or so they thought. Life moved on as it always does after tragedy strikes. Leah's family held a beautiful memorial service at an overlook she'd loved since childhood, where the mountains rolled away to the horizon in endless blue ridges. Her hiking boots, the ones that had carried her safely through thousands of miles of wilderness, were retired to a place of honor on her sister's mantelpiece, flanked by photos of Leah grinning on various summits. The search was officially called off after 6 months, though volunteers continued sporadic efforts for another year. But Sarah Morgan never stopped looking. She couldn't. Every weekend that weather permitted, she drove the 2 hours from Charlotte to the mountains, hiking the same trails Leah had loved, always hoping that maybe this time she'd find some overlooked clue, some sign that would bring her sister home. She organized volunteer searches on every anniversary of Leah's disappearance, recruiting other hikers and climbers who understood that the mountains don't give up their dead easily, but sometimes patience and persistence can succeed where official searches fail. She created a website dedicated to Leah's memory that became a resource for other families dealing with wilderness disappearances. She posted Leah's photo on missing person websites, submitted DNA samples to national databases, and maintained correspondence with search and rescue teams across 3 states. Every month, she called the sheriff's department, asking if there were any new leads, any new information, any reason to hope that this month might be different from the last 47. The answer was always the same: "I'm sorry, ma'am. Nothing new to report." Sarah's friends worried about her obsession, her inability to move on, her refusal to accept that Leah was gone. But Sarah knew something they didn't. She knew that her sister had been the most careful, prepared person she'd ever met. Leah didn't take unnecessary risks. She didn't make fatal mistakes. Something about the official explanation had never felt right, but Sarah couldn't put her finger on what was wrong. She just knew, with the certainty that only comes from a lifetime of sisterhood, that the story they'd been told was incomplete. Then came the summer of 2013, and everything changed. June 23, 2013 started like any other perfect summer day on the French Broad River. The water was running clear and cool, perfect for kayaking. The temperature was a perfect 78 degrees, with just enough breeze to keep the humidity comfortable. Mike Henderson and Janet Reeves, both experienced paddlers with over 20 years on various rivers throughout the Southeast, were enjoying a leisurely float down a section of river they'd navigated dozens of times. The French Broad is ancient, one of the world's oldest rivers, carved through these mountains long before the Appalachians themselves were fully formed. Geologists estimate it's been flowing in roughly its current path for over 300 million years. It's seen everything: Cherokee war parties moving along its banks, Civil War battles fought on its bridges, moonshine runners using its remote reaches to hide their stills, and countless generations of outdoor enthusiasts seeking adventure in its currents. But it had never revealed a secret quite like this. As they approached the abandoned Norfolk Southern Railway bridge, a rusted iron skeleton that hadn't seen a train in 20 years, Janet noticed something unusual caught in the concrete pylons that supported the old structure. The bridge itself was a relic of the region's industrial past, built in 1923 to carry coal trains through the mountains. When the mines closed in the 1990s, the railroad was abandoned, leaving behind these skeletal reminders of a different era. "At first, I thought it was just trash," Janet would later tell investigators, sitting in the fluorescent-lit conference room of the Yancey County Sheriff's Department. "You know, a garbage bag or something that got washed down from upstream during spring runoff. The river collects all kinds of debris." But Mike said, "That looks like straps." They paddled closer, their kayaks cutting silently through water that reflected the summer sky like dark glass. What they found defied 4 years of assumptions about Leah Morgan's fate. It was a backpack. Not just any backpack, but that distinctive emerald green that had become so familiar to search teams, so painfully memorable to Leah's family. Even under layers of river silt and 4 years' worth of algae growth, the color was unmistakable. But here's the thing that made absolutely no sense, the detail that would keep investigators awake for months. The backpack was intact, not shredded by rocks tumbling down mountain streams, not torn apart by 4 years of river current and debris impacts, not damaged by the freeze-thaw cycles that should have made any fabric brittle and prone to tearing. It was wedged carefully beneath the bridge, almost as if it had been gently placed there, protected from the worst of the current, hidden from view but preserved against time. Mike and Janet carefully extracted the pack from its watery hiding place, their hands shaking as they realized what they'd found. The zippers still worked. The buckles were all intact. Even more impossible, when they carefully opened the main compartment, they found items inside that should have disintegrated years ago. Maps that were waterlogged but readable. A journal in a waterproof bag with pages that, while damaged, still contained legible entries. And something that would change everything they thought they knew about Leah Morgan's final hours in the mountains. Detective Ray Kowalski had worked missing persons cases for 12 years, but he'd never encountered anything quite like this. The backpack's location, 47 miles downstream from Leah's last known position, should have been impossible. The river doesn't flow in that direction. Not naturally, anyway. Water from the Black Mountain Trail area should flow east into the Catawba River system, not west into the French Broad. For that backpack to end up where it did, it would have had to travel uphill for part of its journey, defying both gravity and hydrology. But what they found inside the backpack would turn the entire investigation upside down and inside out. Wrapped in multiple layers of waterproof bags, protected like a precious artifact, was a disposable camera. After 4 years underwater, it should have been destroyed. The film should have dissolved into chemical soup. The plastic casing should have cracked from temperature changes. But somehow, impossibly, 17 of the 24 exposures were still intact when the film was developed in the FBI's forensic laboratory in Quantico. The first 14 photos were exactly what you'd expect from a solo hiking trip. Leah grinning at scenic overlooks, her blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, mountains stretching to the horizon behind her, autumn leaves caught in golden afternoon sunlight, the kind of Instagram-worthy shots that make people want to trade their cubicles for hiking boots. A blurry selfie taken in light rain, Leah's bright yellow rain jacket vivid against the gray sky, her smile radiant despite the weather. Normal vacation photos. Happy photos. The kind of images that fill social media feeds every weekend as people document their adventures. But the last 3 frames told a very different story. A story that made hardened investigators question everything they thought they knew about wilderness safety. Frame 22 showed Leah's flashlight beam cutting through absolute darkness, illuminating something that had no business being there. The photo was taken at night. You could tell from the quality of the darkness beyond the flashlight's reach. But in that circle of LED light, standing motionless among the trees just off the trail, was a figure. The image was grainy, shot in low light with a cheap disposable camera. But the silhouette was unmistakably human. Someone was out there in the wilderness with her. Someone who shouldn't have been there. Frame 23 captured the same figure, but closer now. Much closer. The photo was sharper this time, taken with the camera's flash, and you could make out details that sent chills down the spines of everyone who saw it. A dark jacket similar to what any hiker might wear. Heavy boots. Hands hanging at their sides. But here's what was wrong with the picture. The person wasn't hiking. They weren't carrying a pack. They weren't wearing the kind of gear you need to survive in the mountains. They were just standing there in the darkness, motionless as a statue, watching Leah's campsite from the tree-line. Frame 24, the final photo on the roll, was pure chaos. The camera had been turned upside down when the shutter clicked, the flash reflecting off wet ground and fallen leaves in a disorienting kaleidoscope of light and shadow. But in the corner of the frame, blurred by motion but unmistakable in its human shape, was a hand reaching toward the camera. Reaching for Leah. The angle suggested the camera had been dropped or thrown, the final image captured in the split second before impact with the ground. The discovery forced authorities to reopen Leah's case immediately. The FBI was called in within hours. The entire mountain area was searched again with ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging, and the most advanced cadaver dogs available. Forensic teams combed through every frame of that film with magnification technology that could enhance details invisible to the naked eye. Computer specialists ran facial recognition algorithms on the shadowy figure, trying to extract identifying features from the grainy images. But despite months of investigation, despite bringing in the best resources law enforcement had to offer, Leah's remains have never been found. The photos raised more questions than they answered. Who was the figure in the darkness? How had they known exactly where Leah was camping? Why had the storm scattered her gear across miles of wilderness while leaving this one backpack intact and somehow carrying it to an impossible location? The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit created a profile of the unknown person in the photos, but it only added to the mystery. The figure's posture and positioning suggested someone comfortable in wilderness settings, someone who knew how to move silently through dense forest. But their equipment and positioning were all wrong for a legitimate hiker or hunter. They appeared to be stalking Leah's campsite, watching from concealment. To this day, hikers along that stretch of the Blue Ridge whisper about the storm that swallowed Leah Morgan and the stranger her camera seemed to catch in the dark. The photos have been published in missing person bulletins and forensic journals, hoping someone might recognize the mysterious figure, but no identification has ever been made. Local outfitters now tell the story to serious hikers as a cautionary tale about wilderness safety. Even the most experienced outdoors people can encounter dangers that have nothing to do with weather or terrain. Sometimes the greatest threat in the wilderness walks on two legs and watches from the shadows. Because here's the detail that keeps investigators awake at night, the fact that transforms this from a tragic accident into something far more sinister. Leah was the only registered hiker on that section of trail in October 2009. The storm had forced the Park Service to close all other access points 48 hours before she began her hike. The weather warnings had deterred every other outdoor enthusiast in the region. She should have been completely alone out there, the only human being for miles in any direction. But someone else was in those woods. Someone who knew exactly where she was camping, who could navigate treacherous mountain terrain in the middle of a historic storm, who got close enough for her to photograph them in the darkness of her final night. Someone who may have been the last person to see Leah Morgan alive. The backpack's impossible journey downstream to a location it could never have reached naturally. The perfectly preserved camera with its terrifying final images. The photos that revealed a presence in the wilderness that was never supposed to be there. For years after Leah Morgan vanished into a storm, more questions remain than answers. The official investigation remains open, though active leads have been exhausted. The photos continue to circulate among law enforcement agencies, hoping that someday, someone will recognize the figure in the darkness. And somewhere in the mountains of North Carolina, the truth about what happened that October night is still waiting to be discovered. The ancient peaks keep their secrets well, but sometimes they offer glimpses of the darkness that can lurk in even the most beautiful places. Leah's camera caught something in those final moments that was never meant to be seen, preserved against impossible odds, as if the mountains themselves wanted the world to know that she didn't die alone in that storm. Who else was out there with her in the darkness? Why did they want her final photographs to eventually surface? And most chilling of all, are they still out there watching from the shadows, waiting for the next solo hiker to venture too far into the wilderness? The questions echo through the mountains like wind through ancient pines, and 4 years later, the silence that follows is more terrifying than any answer could be.